Welcome back to Retro Lores. Long before players ever died in Lordran, long before tarnished warriors stepped into the lands between, a quiet revolution began in the dark. This is the secret story of King's Field, a PlayStation game that secretly invented the Souls genre 15 years before Dark Souls ever existed. Chapter 1: The Accidental Birth. In November of 1986, a small company was founded in the crowded streets of Tokyo. This new company was called From Software. At first, they had nothing to do with video games. They did not make arcade machines, and they did not design pixel art. Instead, From Software was a business application developer. They spent their days writing database programs for Japanese companies. They built software to track agricultural products and manage office inventory. Their office was filled with serious programmers, business suits, and dry computer code. For nearly 8 years, this was their quiet world. They were good at their jobs, but the work was predictable and plain. Everything changed in the early 1990s. Japan's economic landscape was undergoing a massive shift, and computer technology was advancing at a terrifying speed. Inside the small office of From Software, a few workers began to dream about different possibilities. They noticed that personal computers were becoming powerful enough to render three-dimensional shapes. These were simple polygons, but they felt like magic to anyone who saw them. Notoshi Zin, the founder of From Software, was fascinated by this new technical frontier. He realized that computer code could be used to build living worlds, not just financial spreadsheets. Zin gathered his team and made a bold announcement. From Software was going to pivot away from boring office utilities. They were going to make a video game. The team was excited, but they also faced a massive problem. Not a single person in the studio had ever made a video game before. They had no game designers, no character artists, and no sound engineers. They only had programmers who knew how to write complex code. At the exact same time, electronic giant Sony was preparing to enter the gaming market. Sony was building a new home console called the PlayStation. Unlike Nintendo and Sega, who focused heavily on two-dimensional sprite graphics, Sony was betting everything on real-time 3D polygons. Sony released technical documentation to various software studios across Japan, searching for developers willing to make games for their new machine. Most established game studios were hesitant to work with Sony. Sony had no history in the video game industry, and building games in 3D was uncharted territory. Developing full 3D graphics required expensive computer workstations and complex mathematics. If the PlayStation failed, any studio that invested time and money into its games would go bankrupt. But for From Software, this uncertainty was actually an incredible opportunity. Since they had no legacy in two-dimensional gaming anyway, they had nothing to lose. Notoshi Zin inspected the PlayStation hardware specs and saw immense potential. He decided that From Software would build a game specifically for Sony's launch window. However, he did not want to make a simple arcade game or a colorful mascot platformer. In the mid-1990s, popular Japanese role-playing games were bright, grand, and cinematic. Titles like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest featured heroic music, colorful anime characters, and clear paths to victory. They were designed to make the player feel powerful and legendary. Zin wanted to build something completely opposite. He envisioned a dark, lonely, and immersive dark fantasy experience. He wanted the player to feel small, weak, and terrified inside a deep subterranean graveyard. He chose a first-person perspective so players would look directly through the eyes of the main character. There would be no party members to talk to and no friendly townsfolk cheering you on. You would be completely alone in the dark. The development of King's Field began in mid-1994 with a tiny crew of less than 10 people. Their timeline was brutally short. They had roughly 6 months to build a full, three-dimensional role-playing game from scratch. Because they were starting from zero, they had to build their own custom game engine. They worked long, exhausting hours inside their Tokyo office. Programmers wrote math formulas on whiteboards to calculate how light should bounce off dungeon walls. Artists learned how to stretch low-resolution textures over simple blocky shapes to create skeletons, mummies, and stone walls. The team faced endless technical limitations. The original PlayStation hardware was impressive for 1994, but it had very limited memory. It could only render a small number of polygons on screen at one time before the frame rate would drop. To solve this problem, the team made a creative decision that accidentally shaped the entire atmosphere of the game. They filled the subterranean dungeons with thick, black darkness. Objects and enemies only appeared out of the shadows when the player got close to them. What began as a technical trick to save memory turned into a masterclass in atmospheric tension. The pitch-black fog created a constant sense of dread. Players could hear the wet sliding sound of a giant earthworm or the metallic clinking of armor somewhere in the dark, but they could not see the threat until it was right on top of them. Every hallway felt dangerous because you never knew what was waiting just beyond the edge of your vision. The story of the game was equally stripped back and mysterious. The game takes place in the fallen kingdom of Verdite. Long ago, the realm was protected by a legendary dragon. But dark forces slowly corrupted the land. King Alfred went missing inside a vast underground cemetery, and his royal guards never returned. You play as Jean Alfred Forrester, a lone warrior who enters the haunted subterranean graveyard to find his lost father and recover a legendary sword. There are no long opening cutscenes explaining the lore. There are no detailed character biographies. The game simply drops you at the entrance of the dungeon and expects you to figure everything out on your own. On December 16, 1994, King's Field was officially released in Japan. This was just 13 days after the PlayStation console itself hit store shelves. It was one of the very first three-dimensional role-playing games ever made for a home console. When players bought the game and took it home, the initial reaction was complete shock. Gamers who were used to friendly tutorials and quick action were utterly lost. Within the first 2 minutes of starting the game, most players died. If you turned around at the starting location and walked down a small ramp, you fell directly into a pit of toxic sludge and died immediately. If you walked forward, a giant skeleton warrior could kill you in 2 swings before you even figured out how to swing your sword. The control scheme was notoriously difficult to master. Because the original PlayStation controller did not have analog thumbsticks, players had to use the directional pad to walk and the shoulder buttons to pitch their camera view up and down. Movement was slow, heavy, and deliberate. Turning your character around felt like turning an armored tank. You could not run fast or jump out of the way of incoming attacks. Every step required total focus and patience. Initial reviews from mainstream gaming magazines were mixed and often harsh. Many critics complained that the movement was too sluggish and that the graphics were too dark and muddy. They argued that the game was far too difficult for average players and that it was unfair to kill the player without warning. Some reviewers declared that From Software had made a grave mistake by ignoring established game design rules. However, something unexpected began to happen in early 1995. A dedicated community of players began to form around the game. In early internet chat rooms and Japanese gaming magazines, players started sharing secret maps, weapon locations, and survival strategies. They realized that King's Field was not broken or unfair. It was simply demanding a completely different kind of respect. If you paid attention to your surroundings, listened carefully to sound cues, and managed your stamina, you could survive. Defeating a tough monster provided an intense rush of genuine accomplishment that easier games simply could not match. The total lack of hand-holding made every discovery feel like a real personal triumph. Players felt like true explorers uncovering a dangerous, forgotten world. Word-of-mouth sales began to rise steadily across Japan. The game became a major sleeper hit, eventually selling over 100,000 copies. For a small studio's very first game, built in 6 months by Office software programmers, this was a monumental success. It proved that there was a hungry audience for challenging, mature, and unguided experiences. This financial success saved From Software's video game department and gave them the confidence to pursue dark fantasy games for decades to come. More importantly, it established the core philosophy that would eventually define their studio. Notoshi Zin and his team realized that trusting the player's intelligence was far more rewarding than guiding them by the hand. They learned that fear, isolation, and difficulty could be combined to build unforgettable virtual worlds. In December of 1994, nobody called Kingsfield a Souls game. The term did not exist yet, and the gaming world was not ready to recognize what had just been created. But looking back today, the truth is clear. The DNA of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls was not invented in 2009. It was born right here in a tiny Tokyo office, written in C code by business software developers who took a massive gamble on Sony's new grey box. Chapter 2: Mechanics of Misery. When players loaded Kingsfield for the first time, they expected a heroic adventure. They expected clear directions, friendly characters, and easy battles. Instead, they were greeted by cold stone walls and complete silence. There was no bright title music to cheer you up. There was no companion to tell you where to go next. The game gave you a weak sword and pushed you into the dark. If you took one wrong turn, you met a sudden, brutal death. This was not an accident or a design flaw. It was a complete revolution in how games handled challenge, survival, and player discipline. To understand why Kingsfield felt so shocking, you must look at its stamina system. At the bottom of the screen sat two small meters. One bar was for magic power, and the other bar was for physical stamina. Every time you swung your weapon, your physical stamina bar drained down to 0. While the bar was refilling, your attack power was almost completely gone. If you panicked and mashed the attack button, your character swung wildly with 0 force. Your blade would bounce off enemy armor like a harmless toy. To deal real damage, you had to wait for the meter to fill completely. This simple design choice completely transformed the flow of first-person combat. In most action games of the 1990s, speed was everything. Players won battles by tapping buttons as fast as humanly possible. Kingsfield forced you to stop and breathe. Combat became a slow, careful dance between you and your opponent. You had to step forward into range and deliver a single strong strike. Then you had to back away slowly while your stamina bar recharged. If you rushed your timing, you were punished instantly. This deliberate pace made every single fight feel dangerous and heavy. Even a low-level enemy like a small slime or a skeleton could kill you if you lost focus. You had to learn the exact range of your blade and the reach of your opponent. You had to pay attention to the exact second an enemy raised its weapon to strike. If you made a mistake, you could not simply dodge away instantly. Your movement was heavy and slow, just like a real warrior wearing heavy steel armor. You had to accept the consequences of every single step you took. 15 years later, this exact same mechanic became the fundamental foundation of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. Modern players know the iconic stamina bar as a defining feature of the entire Souls genre. It forces players to manage their energy during intense boss fights. It stops players from mindlessly swinging their heavy weapons without thinking. Yet, this exact system was already working perfectly back in 1994 on the original PlayStation hardware. From Software had already solved the formula for high-stakes melee combat before most modern developers even started making games. The difficulty of Kingsfield went far beyond stamina management and slow combat. The entire world was built like a deadly giant puzzle designed to test your patience and observation skills. Modern games usually give you a detailed minimap in the corner of your screen. They put bright yellow markers on walls to show you where to climb. They give you quest logs that explain your goals step by step. Kingsfield offered none of these modern comforts. You had no map, no compass, and no quest log to guide your journey. Instead, you had to build a mental map of the subterranean world inside your own head. The maze was vertical, dense, and full of strange winding paths that connected in unexpected ways. A dark corridor on the first floor might lead down to a hidden cave system. That cave system might suddenly climb back up to a ledge above your original starting point. To survive, players had to pay close attention to every distinct stone texture and lighting change. Many early players kept a real paper notebook on their desks to draw their own physical maps. The layout of the world was full of secret passages tucked behind plain walls. If you walked up to a solid stone wall and pressed the search button, the stone might slide open quietly. Behind these illusionary walls lay hidden treasure chests, rare healing potions or shortcuts back to earlier areas. Sometimes, pressing a hidden switch opened a door on the complete opposite side of the floor. You were constantly rewarded for curious behavior, careful listening, and deep exploration. The game trusted you to discover its deepest secrets entirely on your own terms. This spatial design was a direct ancestor to the legendary world structure of Dark Souls. Fans always praise the original Dark Souls for its brilliant, interconnected world map. They love how Lordran wraps around itself, connecting distant zones through hidden elevators and unexpected doors. But this spatial magic was already the signature style of From Software in 1994. The Labyrinth of Verdite was designed with the exact same philosophy of spatial continuity. Finding a hidden door that looped back to a safe room provided an incredible feeling of pure relief. Relief was short-lived because death was always waiting around the very next corner. In modern games, dying is usually a very minor inconvenience. The game simply restarts you a few seconds back at an automatic checkpoint. You lose almost no progress, and you can try again immediately without fear. Kingsfield treated death with terrifying gravity and weight. The game did not save your progress automatically at all. If you wanted to save your game, you had to find rare, glowing dragon fountains hidden deep in the dungeon. These fountains were few and far between, tucked away in quiet, isolated corners of the world. Walking deep into a brand new, unexplored floor was an exercise in pure psychological tension. The further you walked from your last save point, the higher the stakes became. If you died, you lost everything you had accomplished since your last visit to a fountain. You lost all your gathered treasure, your level progress, and your mapped paths. Dying after 2 hours of tense exploration was a truly devastating emotional blow. This design created a real sense of dread every time you entered a new room. Every creaking door and shadowy corner felt like a serious threat to your hard-earned progress. You found yourself pausing at every doorway, listening carefully to the eerie audio cues echoing through the dark. You learned to check the ceiling for falling traps and inspect the floor for hidden pressure plates. Survival demanded absolute respect for the environment. Fear was not just a narrative theme, it was an active gameplay mechanic that changed how you physically played. The environment itself was packed with brutal traps designed to punish careless players. Floors would suddenly crumble beneath your feet, dropping you into deep pits filled with spikes. Poisonous gas filled small treasure rooms, slowly draining your health while you searched for loot. Chests were sometimes rigged with magical traps that blasted cold air or fire directly into your face. Even the water near the starting area was toxic, killing curious players within seconds of entering the game. The world felt ancient, dangerous, and completely indifferent to your survival. Because the game was so mysterious and unforgiving, strange urban legends began to spread among early players. In the mid-1990s, internet access was still rare and very limited. Players could not simply look up a complete strategy guide or watch a video walkthrough on YouTube. Instead, rumors were passed around school playgrounds, gaming club meetings, and early online bulletin boards. Players spoke in hushed tones about legendary weapons that could one-shot dark knights. They claimed that hitting certain walls 50 times would reveal hidden towns full of friendly wizards. One famous rumor claimed that there was a secret way to cure the toxic water at the start of the game immediately. Players believed that if you threw a specific ring into the sludge, the water would turn crystal clear. Other rumors suggested that certain unkillable monsters would drop godlike armor if you fought them for an hour straight. While most of these stories were completely false, they added an incredible layer of magic to the community experience. The world of King's Field felt so deep and mysterious that players were willing to believe almost anything was possible. This phenomenon proved that cryptic game design actually brings communities closer together. When a game refuses to explain itself, players are forced to talk to each other to solve its mysteries. They compare maps, share survival tricks, and debate the meaning of obscure lore items. From Software saw how powerful this community bonding was back in 1994. They realized that leaving gaps in the information made the game feel infinitely larger than it actually was. Mystery was a powerful tool that captured the human imagination like nothing else. The mechanics of King's Field were never meant to be needlessly cruel or spiteful. The developers did not make the game hard just to frustrate players or force them to quit. The extreme difficulty had a clear artistic purpose. From Software understood a fundamental truth about human psychology and achievement. A victory feels meaningless if it is handed to you without any real effort or risk. The greater the struggle required to overcome an obstacle, the greater the emotional high you feel when you finally succeed. When you finally defeated a giant skeletal knight after 5 failed attempts, the feeling was unmatched. Your heart pounded against your ribs and your hands shook on the plastic controller. You did not win because the game took pity on you or lowered the difficulty. You won because you learned the enemy's attack pattern, managed your stamina perfectly, and kept your cool under intense pressure. You earned that victory through pure skill, patience, and mental focus. You felt like a true survivor who had earned the right to see the next dark room. This core loop of tension, death, learning, and ultimate triumph became the soul of From Software's identity. It was the exact emotional core that made Demon's Souls a cult classic many years later. It was the principle that made Dark Souls a global phenomenon across the entire world. Long before the term "Git Gud" became a popular internet meme, King's Field was demanding the exact same discipline from its players. It taught a generation of gamers that true satisfaction comes from overcoming genuine hardship in the dark. Chapter 3: Environmental Principles. In the middle of the 1990s, most video games loved to talk. Popular role-playing games filled your television screen with long pages of scrolling text. Colorful characters stopped every few minutes to explain their personal feelings, dramatic backstories, and noble goals. Loud, heroic music played while majestic kings told you about ancient prophecies and chosen warriors. You were always the absolute center of the universe, surrounded by friendly, non-player characters waiting to speak. King's Field rejected this noisy approach completely. It understood that silence could tell a much deeper, far scarier, and more meaningful story. When you stepped into the dark underground realm of Verdite, nobody greeted you at the entrance. There were no grand cinematic cutscenes showing the tragic fall of the royal kingdom. There were no cheerful townsfolk hanging around fire pits to give you clear instructions or quest markers. The world was already dead, and you were simply walking through its vast subterranean grave. The history of the kingdom was not written in friendly books or spoken aloud by wise wizards. It was etched directly into crumbling stone walls, rusting steel armor, and silent bone piles scattered across dark corners. This radical approach to narrative design was practically unheard of on home consoles at the time. Video games were widely expected to guide players step by step like a Saturday morning cartoon show. Most mainstream game developers believed that players needed constant dialogue and active guidance to stay interested in a plot. From Software proved that belief completely wrong by placing total trust in the natural curiosity of the player. They allowed the virtual environment itself to act as the primary storyteller of the entire experience. Every single room inside the underground maze had a quiet, tragic story to tell if you paid attention. You might enter a tiny stone chamber and discover 2 skeletons lying cold on the damp ground. One skeleton held an empty potion bottle inside its bony hand. The other skeleton was pinned tightly against the wall by a heavy rusted iron spear. The game never explained what happened in that room through text boxes or spoken voice acting. You did not receive a quest update, a diary entry, or a menu notification explaining the scene. Instead, your own imagination naturally filled in the tragic details of their final moments. You quickly realized that two desperate soldiers had fought to the death over the very last remaining potion. One soldier had betrayed his companion, only to die from his own severe wounds seconds later. This form of environmental storytelling required active mental effort from the person holding the grey plastic controller. You were no longer just a passive player pressing buttons to increase numbers and win a game. You were a true archaeologist carefully examining ancient physical ruins to reconstruct forgotten historical truths. The architecture of the cavern system clearly revealed the historic rise and fall of the subterranean kingdom. Lower dungeon floors featured crude, rough-cut stone tunnels carved out by desperate, overworked miners long ago. Higher floors showcased magnificent marble arches, polished stone pillars, and ornate fountain plazas built by wealthy royal families. As you climbed deeper or ascended higher, the physical structures reflected shifting eras of political power and social class. You could visually trace the slow decay of an entire civilization simply by looking at the stone walls around you. Even the physical placement of enemy monsters made logical sense within the virtual ecosystem of the cavern. Ferocious wild beasts nested near stagnant pools of water or near piles of decaying organic matter. Undead royal knights guarded dusty vault doors, forever bound to their final military assignments from centuries past. Nothing felt randomly placed just to give the player something easy to hit with a sword. The world felt like a real functioning environment that had existed long before your character arrived. It would continue to exist in cold silence long after your character died in the dark. Beyond the architecture and static corpses, the true narrative was carefully buried inside inventory item descriptions. In almost every 1990s video game, inventory items were simple utility tools with basic numerical stats. An iron sword simply gave your character 5 extra points of physical attack power. A basic leather shield increased your overall defense stat by 3 small points. Item descriptions were short, functional, and completely devoid of any real narrative depth or world-building mystery. King's Field turned every single item into a precious historical artifact waiting to be deciphered. When you picked up a strange golden ring or a rusted iron helmet, the inventory menu provided cryptic lore fragments. A simple bronze key might mention a court wizard who mysteriously vanished during a brutal castle siege. A small silver ring might reveal the secret treason of a forgotten royal prince who betrayed his own father. None of these text fragments gave you the complete narrative picture on their own. They were tiny, scattered pieces of a massive, intricate historical jigsaw puzzle waiting to be assembled by the player. To understand the complete story of Verdite, players had to collect dozens of items and cross-reference their text. You had to connect names, dates, and locations mentioned across weapons, armor, keys, and magical rings. Reading a sword description might explain why a specific monstrous boss was waiting inside a lonely locked room. Discovering a magical amulet might reveal the tragic cosmic origin of a terrible royal curse that destroyed an empire. The game never forced you to read any of this hidden text to reach the ending screen. If you only cared about real-time combat, you could ignore the lore completely and just keep swinging your sword. However, for observant players who took the time to read, the experience became extraordinarily rich and deeply rewarding. The game world gained immense depth, thick atmosphere, and historical weight through these tiny optional text fragments. This exact method of fragmented narrative delivery would eventually become the core identity of From Software. Decades later, millions of modern gamers would spend hundreds of hours reading item text in games like Elden Ring. They would analyze every single weapon description to reconstruct the secret history of the lands between. That massive global culture started right here with short text entries written in 1994. Among all the hidden lore, ancient artifacts, and secret weapons, one single item stood far above the rest. That legendary item was the iconic Sword of Moonlight, which later became known as the Moonlight Greatsword. In the dark universe of King's Field, this magnificent glowing blade was not just a powerful physical weapon. It was a wholly divine artifact deeply tied to the grand cosmic lore of the entire world. The sword was originally forged by the White Dragon Seath to combat overwhelming dark forces threatening the realm. Finding the Moonlight Sword in the original King's Field required incredible effort, patience, and secret spatial knowledge. It was never handed to you as an automatic reward for simply completing a mandatory main story quest. It was hidden deep inside the most dangerous floor of the labyrinth, guarded by terrifying deadly hazards. Obtaining the glowing blade felt like a massive personal victory that completely changed the tide of your difficult journey. When swung by the player, the blade unleashed beautiful, destructive waves of bright green magic across the room. It was the ultimate power fantasy, rewarding dedicated players who thoroughly explored every dark inch of the game. The deep story behind the weapon introduced grand, cosmic themes that spanned across multiple game sequels over many years. The lore spoke of an eternal cosmic conflict between two ancient dragons, named Seath the White Dragon and Gyra the Black Dragon. Seath represented holy light, magical creation, and order, while Gyra embodied deep darkness, raw chaos, and destruction. Their ancient war shaped the subterranean geography of the kingdom and corrupted the minds of mortal human kings. This cosmic background elevated the narrative far beyond a simple fantasy story about killing a bad king in a cave. The Moonlight Sword quickly became much more than a cool high-level weapon inside a single standalone game. It transformed into the ultimate sacred signature and lucky charm for the entire From Software development studio. In 1997, From Software released their famous mech action game, called Armored Core, on the original PlayStation. Even inside a futuristic sci-fi game about giant flying robots, developers hid a powerful high-tech laser blade called Moonlight. Players who recognized the familiar name smiled, realizing the secret connection to their favorite dark fantasy dungeon crawler. As the decades passed, the legend of the Moonlight Sword continued to grow across multiple generations of gaming consoles. It appeared in various forms across Otogi, Ninja Blade, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. In the dark Victorian world of Bloodborne, the weapon was carried by the tragic, mutated boss Ludwig the Holy Blade. When Ludwig discovered the glowing sword during his mid-fight transformation, he briefly regained his lost human sanity and honor. The weapon transformed from a simple digital item into a legendary symbol spanning over 30 years of gaming history. The bold narrative choices made in King's Field established the foundational ground rules for modern environmental storytelling. Long before environmental narrative became a trendy buzzword among modern AAA game studios, From Software was quietly mastering the craft. They proved that players naturally love solving atmospheric mysteries far more than being handed pre-chewed answers on a silver platter. By leaving intentional thematic gaps in the narrative, they invited the player to become an active collaborator in the storytelling process. This unique approach fundamentally changed how players emotionally connected with virtual game environments and fictional worlds. When you figure out a subtle plot twist on your own by connecting environmental clues, the moment feels truly special. It feels like a real personal discovery rather than a predictable script written by a corporate Hollywood screenwriter. You fully own the emotional realization because your own human brain put the scattered clues together in the dark. That profound sense of narrative ownership builds an unbreakable, unforgettable bond between the player and the virtual world. King's Field demonstrated once and for all that video games do not need to copy movies to tell amazing stories. Interactive media possesses a unique structural advantage that traditional movies and printed books can never duplicate or match. Games can tell rich, complex stories through space, architecture, careful object placement, and unguided player exploration. The world itself can serve as the main character, telling its tragic history through structural decay, complete silence, and physical memory. When Demon's Souls was released globally in 2009, many prominent game critics praised its unique storytelling methods. They wrote glowing reviews about how refreshing it was to play a game that avoided long, boring cutscenes. They celebrated the clever item descriptions and the subtle world design as brilliant, brand new game design inventions. But older retro gamers who had played the original PlayStation title in 1994 knew the deeper truth. They recognized that From Software was simply polishing the exact same storytelling gems they had mined 15 years earlier. The silent world, the hidden item lore, and the glowing green sword had been waiting patiently in the dark all along. Chapter 4. Growing Up. The success of the original King's Field in late 1994 changed From Software forever. The small Japanese company was no longer just a business software team writing financial programs. They were now a full game studio with a proven hit on their hands. Over the next decade, the developers expanded on their dark vision across multiple console generations. They refined their tough mechanics, deepened their world's design, and built a loyal fan base. However, as the video game industry changed around them, the studio faced new creative challenges. To understand how modern Souls games were created, we must trace this fascinating historical evolution. Following their initial success, From Software quickly began working on a bigger, grander sequel. King's Field 2 was released in Japan in late 1995, just 1 year later. When the game was brought to North America, publishers simply called it King's Field. This naming change created decades of confusion for Western gamers trying to track the series' history. The sequel improved every single aspect of the original title while keeping its ruthless core intact. The graphics were smoother, the subterranean world was much larger, and the combat was far more responsive. Instead of starting inside a dark underground cemetery, players began their journey on a stormy beach. You were a warrior shipwrecked on the haunted island of Melanat, searching for a royal sword. The map was entirely connected, allowing players to walk across the island without seeing loading screens. You could climb high mountain paths, explore flooded sea caves, and venture deep into active volcanoes. The world felt like a living physical place, rather than a collection of separate maze floors. By 1996, King's Field 3 completed the original trilogy on the first PlayStation hardware. While the main series was popular, From Software wanted to experiment with even darker fantasy ideas. In 1998, they released a revolutionary spin-off game called Shadow Tower on the PlayStation. Shadow Tower stripped away almost all remaining traditional role-playing elements to focus purely on horror and survival. There was no background music playing in the dungeons as you explored the gloomy depths. The silence was broken only by the eerie sound of your heavy footsteps echoing off walls. You could hear the terrifying growls of unseen monsters lurking somewhere in the pitch-black darkness. Shadow Tower introduced several mechanics that felt shockingly ahead of its time for 1998. Equipment durability became a constant source of anxiety as weapons rusted and armor broke during battle. You could not simply buy items at a cozy shop using gold coins found on enemies. Instead, you had to trade your own precious health points to purchase vital survival supplies. The game also featured a detailed creature handbook that recorded every monster you successfully defeated. Shadow Tower was a cold, brutal experience that pushed dungeon crawling to its absolute limits. By the turn of the century, Sony launched its powerful new console, the PlayStation 2. From Software embraced this next generation of home console hardware with immense creative energy and passion. They developed Eternal Ring as a launch title in 2000, focusing heavily on magic creation. Shortly after, they released King's Field 4, known in Western regions as the Ancient City. Released in 2001, King's Field 4 is widely considered the absolute peak of the series. It featured breathtaking environmental lighting, deeply depressing atmospheric music, and an overwhelmingly gloomy, forgotten world. Despite its exceptional quality, King's Field 4 faced a rapidly changing global video game market. By the early 2000s, home console games were becoming faster, brighter, and far more cinematic. Fast-paced third-person action games like Devil May Cry and God of War dominated store shelves everywhere. Mainstream game reviewers criticized Kingsfield 4 for its slow turning speed and heavy movement. They called the game outdated, overly difficult, and too dark for modern gaming audiences. First-person dungeon crawlers were quickly falling out of style across the global gaming industry. From Software made one final attempt at first-person survival horror with Shadow Tower Abyss in 2003. Released exclusively in Japan, the game introduced modern firearms alongside traditional fantasy swords and shields. Players could use shotguns to blast off monster limbs, featuring a primitive regional damage system. You could shoot off a demon's arm to prevent it from swinging a heavy axe. Despite these clever design innovations, the game sold poorly and never received an official Western release. The era of the slow, first-person, dark fantasy dungeon crawler seemed to be drawing to a close. By 2004, From Software was primarily known for its fast robot action franchise, Armored Core. The studio was struggling to find a new hit fantasy franchise that connected with modern audiences. Around this time, a new developer joined From Software who would change the company's trajectory forever. His name was Hidetaka Miyazaki, a former IT manager who made a late career switch. Miyazaki was 30 years old and had no prior experience in video game design at all. He took a massive pay cut to join From Software as a low-level planner on Armored Core. Inside the studio, a new dark fantasy project called Demon's Souls was undergoing extremely troubled development. The project was conceived as an action role-playing game set in a grim fantasy universe. However, the development team was struggling to build a clear working prototype for the game. The controls felt clumsy, the camera was awkward, and internal playtests were receiving terrible feedback. From Software management viewed the project as a complete failure that would likely lose money upon release. The title was close to being cancelled completely before it even saw the light of day. When Hidetaka Miyazaki heard about the struggling fantasy game, he saw an incredible personal opportunity. He went to company executives and asked if he could take full control of the project. Miyazaki knew that the studio had already written off the game as an unavoidable loss. He realized that if his radical design ideas failed, nobody would blame him for the disaster. He had complete freedom to change anything he wanted because the project was considered beyond saving. Miyazaki stepped in as game director and completely redesigned the project from the ground up. Miyazaki was a massive fan of classic dark fantasy literature and tabletop role-playing games. But more importantly, he deeply understood the hidden brilliance of From Software's early history and heritage. He looked back at games like Kingsfield and Shadow Tower with immense respect and admiration. He realized that their core philosophy, unforgiving difficulty, stamina management, and spatial exploration was still inherently brilliant. The problem was not the core philosophy itself, but how that philosophy was presented to modern players. Miyazaki decided to retain the atmospheric soul of Kingsfield while updating its mechanical presentation. The most important structural change he made was shifting the camera from first person to third person. Placing the camera behind the player character solved several major movement and spatial awareness issues. Players could now see their character's heavy armor, dodge rolls, and precise weapon swings during combat. It made the high-stakes melee battles feel far more dynamic, responsive, and visually exciting on screen. However, almost every single foundational mechanic from Kingsfield was carefully preserved and modernized. The stamina bar remained the central engine governing every physical attack, block, and dodge roll. The world was designed around interconnected levels, hidden shortcuts, and spatial traps waiting in dark rooms. Environmental storytelling returned as the primary narrative method, hiding deep historical lore inside cryptic item text. Death retained its terrifying emotional weight, taking away your gathered currency every time you made a fatal error. Miyazaki also added innovative modern online features that perfectly complemented the feeling of terrifying isolation. Players could leave short messages on the ground to warn others of upcoming deadly hazards or traps. You could see the ghostly, spectral forms of other real players wandering through the exact same world. When a player died, they left behind a red bloodstain that showed their final agonizing seconds. These passive online elements allowed players across the globe to help each other survive without breaking immersion. When Demon's Souls was first demonstrated at the Tokyo Game Show in 2008, it was an absolute disaster. Players who tried the game demo were confused by its steep difficulty and slow pace. Many players could not even figure out how to pass the first tutorial area before dying. Crowds walked away from the booth, and senior industry executives publicly criticized the game's difficult design. Sony executive Shuhei Yoshida played the game and famously called it absolute garbage after playing for hours. When Demon's Souls was officially released in Japan in February 2009, initial sales were extremely poor. Sony declined to publish the game in Western markets, believing it would be a guaranteed financial failure. However, just like King's Field in 1994, something magical began to happen through word of mouth. Gamers who actually spent time with the game discovered an unforgettable, deeply rewarding fantasy masterpiece. American publisher Atlas recognized the game's cult popularity and decided to publish it in North America later that year. Demon's Souls went on to become a massive global sleeping hit, winning numerous Game of the Year awards. Gamers and critics celebrated the title as a groundbreaking revolution that saved gaming from hand-holding and easy tutorials. They praised its incredible atmospheric world, its deep stamina combat, and its mysterious environmental storytelling methods. The media praised Hidetaka Miyazaki as a visionary genius who had single-handedly invented a brand new gaming genre. Yet, those who remembered the original PlayStation era knew the real story behind this sudden revolution. Miyazaki had not invented these radical principles out of thin air in 2009. He had dusted off the forgotten blueprints created by business software developers 15 years earlier. He took the cold, dark, and unforgiving legacy of King's Field and gave it a modern heart. The soul of the genre had been alive all along, waiting in the subterranean shadows for someone to bring it back to light. Chapter 5: The Legacy. When Dark Souls arrived on store shelves in 2011, it caused a massive global earthquake. The game became an unexpected cultural phenomenon that dominated video game discussions everywhere. Millions of players fell in love with its challenging combat, dark lore, and unforgiving world. Game journalists and passionate fans quickly created a brand new genre label called Souls-like. Every difficult action game released over the next decade was compared to From Software's dark masterpiece. Other major studios rushed to copy the stamina bar, the bonfire save points, and the lost currency mechanics. However, the creation of the popular term Souls-like contained a quiet historical tragedy. By naming the genre after a 2011 release, the industry erased its true origins. Modern gamers believed that Hidetaka Miyazaki had created these revolutionary mechanics out of thin air. They did not realize that the entire design framework was already 17 years old. Everything that made Dark Souls special was already working inside a quiet PlayStation game in 1994. The real birth of the genre happened inside the dark, subterranean corridors of King's Field. To truly appreciate the legacy of King's Field, one must look at the direct lineage connecting it to modern titles. The mechanical DNA of that original PS1 game runs through every single modern From Software release. When you play Elden Ring today, you are playing the ultimate evolution of King's Field. The vast, open fields of the lands between are simply the underground maze of Verdite opened up beneath the sky. The underlying principles of player freedom, environmental danger, and spatial exploration remain completely identical. Consider the iconic elements that define modern From Software games across all current gaming platforms. In Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, players pass through foggy smoke walls to confront terrifying bosses. That fog wall was born from the limited rendering distance of the original PlayStation hardware. In King's Field, thick black fog hid monsters until you were standing directly next to them. What began as a clever technical trick to save memory became a permanent signature visual style. From Software turned hardware limitations into an art form that defined their artistic identity for 30 years. The infamous poison swamps found in almost every From Software game share this exact same lineage. Players famously dread exploring swamp areas like Blighttown in Dark Souls or the Lake of Rot in Elden Ring. These hazardous zones force players to move slowly while their health bar continuously drains away. This exact environmental hazard appeared in the very first room of Kingsfield in 1994. Stepping into the dark green sludge near the starting point killed unprepared players instantly. From Software has been tormenting players with toxic water for over 3 decades without showing any mercy. Even the character interactions and storytelling methods share an unbroken historical bond. In modern Souls-like games, non-player characters speak in cryptic, mysterious sentences before breaking into eerie laughter. They rarely give you clear instructions and often disappear without warning to pursue their own goals. This strange, distant tone was established in the quiet underground halls of Verdit long ago. The non-player characters of Kingsfield spoke in brief, melancholic phrases that made the world feel old and tired. The developers understood that distant, tragic characters made the virtual world feel vastly more realistic and authentic. The influence of Kingsfield reaches far beyond the walls of From Software's own development studio. During the late 2000s, the AAA gaming industry was moving in a very specific direction. Major publishers were obsessed with making games feel like cinematic, high-budget Hollywood movies. They added endless cinematic cutscenes, unskippable tutorials, and obvious directional markers on every screen. Games began painting yellow paint on ledges to show players exactly where to jump. Minimaps were filled with hundreds of colorful icons showing every secret location in advance. This trend made games far more accessible, but it also stripped away all sense of real discovery. Players were no longer exploring virtual worlds. They were simply following digital breadcrumbs along a linear path. There was no risk of getting lost, no fear of sudden death, and no real triumph. The industry assumed that modern players were lazy and lacked the patience for difficult, complex challenges. Developers believed that if a player got stuck for 5 minutes, they would quit and return the game. From Software proved that the entire philosophy was completely wrong by clinging tightly to their 1994 heritage. They refused to add minimaps, easy difficulty settings, or bright yellow directional markers to their games. They trusted that players were intelligent, capable, and hungry for genuine mental and physical engagement. When Demon's Souls and Dark Souls succeeded, it sent a massive shockwave through the entire industry. It proved that millions of players actually wanted to be challenged, tested, and respected by game creators. This realization ignited a massive counter-revolution across the global video game landscape. Independent developers around the world began building their own challenging dark fantasy action games. Titles like Hollow Knight, Nioh, Lies of P, and Salt and Sanctuary drew direct inspiration from Software's design playbook. Entire subgenres of indie games adopted stamina management, corpse retrieval mechanics, and cryptic environmental narrative design. The stubborn philosophy of a small team of Japanese database programmers in 1994 had redefined global game design. Today, the Souls-like genre is one of the most profitable and critically acclaimed genres in entertainment history. In 2022, From Software released Elden Ring to universal critical acclaim and monumental commercial success. The game sold over 25 million copies worldwide and won hundreds of Game of the Year awards. Millions of casual gamers who had never heard of From Software were suddenly discussing obscure lore and difficult boss fights. The once obscure game design philosophy of a tiny Tokyo studio had officially conquered the mainstream world. Yet, despite this massive global success, the historical contribution of the original Kingsfield remains largely forgotten. Most modern players who spend hundreds of hours in Elden Ring have no idea that Kingsfield exists. They do not know the name of Naotoshi Zin or the Office programmers who took a risk in 1994. The original PlayStation game sits in historical shadows, preserved mainly by retro gaming historians and dedicated collectors. It is a quiet masterpiece that laid the foundation for a billion-dollar empire without ever receiving full public credit. We must honor the visionary risk taken by Naotoshi Zin and his small team of programmers. They had no background in game design, no expensive motion capture equipment, and no proven template to follow. They only had a deep belief that video games could be serious, atmospheric, and uncompromisingly challenging. In just 6 short months, they built a custom 3D game engine and created an entirely new way to experience virtual fantasy. They looked at the bright, friendly arcade trends of 1994 and chose to walk into total darkness. If From Software had compromised on their original vision, the history of video games would look completely different today. If they had added easy tutorials or removed the stamina bar, King's Field might have been forgotten immediately. By holding firm to their unique principles, they created a timeless design language that survived for over 30 years. They proved that true artistic vision can withstand changing corporate trends and shifting technological eras. The cold, quiet halls of Verdite established a standard of excellence that continues to inspire developers to this day. At its core, the ultimate legacy of King's Field is a fundamental lesson about human resilience and respect. The game treats the player not as a child needing constant entertainment, but as an intelligent, capable adult. It offers no cheap praise or unearned rewards for simply showing up and pressing buttons. It demands your complete focus, your careful observation, and your willingness to learn from repeated failure. When you survive its pitch-black dungeons, you experience a rare form of authentic pride that cannot be fake or simulated. That unique emotional experience is why millions of people around the world remain deeply obsessed with From Software games. In a world full of easy distractions and instant gratification, these games offer a rare space for genuine struggle. They remind us that failure is not the end of the journey, but a necessary step toward true mastery. Every time you die in a Souls-like game, you learn something new about the world and about yourself. You pick yourself up, brush off the dust, and step back into the dark corridor with renewed focus. The next time you step through a foggy smoke wall in Elden Ring or Dark Souls, take a moment to remember where it all started. Think back to late December in 1994, inside a small Tokyo office filled with business computers. Imagine a player holding a grey PlayStation controller, looking into a pitch-black screen with no map and no guidance. Remember the quiet sound of heavy footsteps echoing off damp stone walls in the subterranean darkness of Verdite. That forgotten PS1 game did not just start a franchise, it quietly invented the soul of modern gaming.